Libertarians need to become social democrats. Just kidding. Libertarians need to become the libertarian equivalent of a social democrat. What do I mean by that? The Social Democrats, or SocDems, are a movement that, like the Marxists to their left, and the social anarchists to their even further left, push for a classless society free from the oppression of private property. Now, SocDems do so piece by piece, bit by bit. They do not try to overthrow bourgeois, liberal, democratic society through a massive insurrectionary revolution, but instead use democracy to slowly nationalise the economy to bring about the supposed dictatorship of the proletariat. This is how what we call the British welfare state was created, but the process is about far, far more than welfare ideologically. It's about the end result, and the end result is supposed to be a socialist society. The best part of this whole thing is that they don't even need to keep their ends in mind the whole time. They just need to keep applying their means. Mistakes can be made, of course. When the British Labour Party pushed its means too far and wrote the longest suicide note in history, yes, that was a setback and resulted in the necessity to move towards the centre and New Labour. But time marches on, and you can always climb back on the same horse when it's time to do so. Now Cowboy Corbyn can take the reins to ride on back to the left. The Conservatives haven't done much damage to social democratic institutions anyway, in spite of the palpable outrage. Ebb and flow to be sure, but the tide always goes a bit further up the beach. In addition, a historical process occurred in favour of SocDems. The left of classical liberalism eventually became social liberals of the million stripe, who eventually, through the progressive movement in America and the New Deal, became the modern progressive liberals, now present across the Anglosphere. While the ends of a progressive liberal are much less explicitly Marxist and much more culturally constructed, although some would say the latter hyphen the former, you know what I'm saying, the two movements of social democracy and modern liberalism have largely blended together and become indistinguishable. The Social Democrat asks the Progressive Liberal to nationalise healthcare, and he does. The Progressive Liberal asks the Social Democrat to check his privilege, and he does. So, Social Democrats have been successful, wildly so. Of course, anyone born in the last 20 years can imagine a Thatcherite consensus to have taken hold, and they would not be totally wrong. The thing about that is that such a consensus around narrow issues took place within the context of a system that had already been pushing in the same direction since the 1930s, if not much earlier. In any case, the Social Democrats have taken us far, far indeed. The Marxist communists are nothing compared. Yes, they might have promulgated some ideas which hold influence in the mainstream, but their core doctrines of action have been miserably ineffective at producing revolutions in developed Western countries. It's no coincidence that communists had their most success in what were semi-feudal economies with large peasant classes. Social democratic ideas have taken the world by storm. You can yap about neoliberalism all you want, but you are usually doing so from countries with national minimum wages, affirmative action, and socialised healthcare. There's a long way to fall, isn't there? The SocDems did all this while making concessions to capitalism and bourgeois society, and the libertarians need to learn from that. But how do you make concessions without becoming your enemy? Well, firstly, concessions to reality are needed. I'm harsh on the Austrians, but they have some truths. Shock horror, so do the Keynesians. I feel like getting into the details of that would be a better subject for another video, but in a very general sense the issue is the same as the one I started this video with. Sometimes the unfettered market just amorally shrugs its shoulders and bad things happen to certain groups. Accepting that the market can't save us all of the time is a must. Don't lie to progressives. Not only that, but that is exactly where the concessions must be made. In order to work through the system rather than against it, we must again consider the minority nature of our ethical position. Whether through genetics or class or culture, we are a demographic minority, politically. We will get none of what we want if we try to get all of what we want at once. Politics is about selling a product a product that must have broad appeal if we are to sell it to the monopsonistic entity called the democratic will. This is not about concealing what you really want, like some kind of Austrian supervillain. It's about changing your priorities and changing what you consider to be an imposition against your end goals. People want a safety net. The left already offers them a safety net. So how can we distinguish ourselves? As I stated earlier, the goal for the left is about far more than just a minimum standard. The left doesn't just want a floor for society, but also a ceiling. A low ceiling. They want abstract equality, really. That's what being left-wing is about. Instrumentally, the left has put in place not just restitution for the propertyless and a safety net for life and health, but also an extensive system of controls on wages, regulation on starting a business, regulations on how to run a business, zoning laws, overzealous health and safety that governs not just business but private gatherings, affirmative action, gender quotas, public funding for all sorts of educational courses that are unnecessary, public funding for minor forms of healthcare leading to overuse of drugs and antibiotics, government pensions, and the list just goes on and on. Expect nationalised and inefficient utilities to make a comeback the next time the left flow passes beyond the conservative ebb, by the way. The point is, there's a wide open space for meeting the concerns people have with issues of poverty that libertarians can pragmatically address while doing so in a more libertarian and efficient manner than the left. Some libertarians have done so before, or tried to. Hayek proposed restitution for the propertyless. Milton Friedman proposed a negative income tax to subsidise lower incomes. The critical thing would be to propose policies that offer a more effective replacement to current government policies on labour and welfare issues. A more practical libertarian movement would still have to not compromise its integrity and offer alternatives rather than simply piling on extra programmes on top of ones which already exist. For example, there are good arguments for income subsidisation as a replacement for the minimum wage, not only from a libertarian perspective, but from an economic standpoint as well. A national minimum wage is a problem in that it sets a fixed cost per unit of labour regardless of sectorial or local variation in the degree of labour costs. That same fixed cost also hits small business harder and can lead to layoffs. The minimum wage can actually assist the maintenance of monopolies since it creates an extra barrier to entry for businesses. Income subsidisation, meanwhile, instead of laying the biggest burdens on small business, would take from the already progressive tax base and thereby lay the burden on larger corporations and high-income earners. This kind of policy change, while not palatable to left-wing or libertarian ideologues, may be palatable to moderate voters who are centre-left but libertarian-leaning in their sympathies. As we've discussed, libertarians in no sense have the option of completely turning the tide over to their side for pure political demographics. Compromising over welfare means providing the most efficient and libertarian-compatible version of welfare possible, not just doing whatever the left says. Income subsidisation, negative income tax, or a basic income guarantee, a national health service free at the point of use for emergency care, and early warning treatment for cancers, but not free at the point of use for every minor ailment under the sun, a school system that prioritises future-ready STEM subjects while making cuts to other subjects such as English, history, media, etc. Engaging in politics in this way allows libertarians to completely cut off the most common leftist arguments against libertarianism, since these are typically based on arguing that libertarians don't care about the poor and the sick, which in many cases may be true. Furthermore, the ethical libertarian argument against welfare and government services is only a roundabout one. It is taxes which are taken to fund these programs which involve ethical violations in that you are being threatened with being thrown in a cage if you do not comply. However, as long as you are not an anarchist and you recognise the necessity of a final monopoly on law, you accept that the minimal state will take from your income the proceeds necessary to fund the military, law enforcement and the courts which are used to protect property. Naturally, while this is already a compromise to coercion to prevent theoretical greater coercion in the Hobbesian war of all against all, a libertarian wishes to avoid a larger magnitude of taxation on top of the essential amount necessary to fund the basic monopoly on law and protection of property. The ethical opposition to welfare by way of coercive funding is a matter of degree then. and the real opposition is to the coercive means of supplying services. If anything can be compromised on, it is the case of restitution for the propertyless and terminally jobless. Liberty in the exercise of choice, after all, can only be engaged in if you are alive to do so. Another objection is not ethical but economic. Austrian economists and their less hardcore Chicago school friends tend to make the argument that in the absence of welfare, the private sector would have helped the genuinely desperate people, and that government welfare simply creates an ever-expanding class of people in a welfare trap, unable to enter work. The government will tend to expand these entitlements with deficit spending until it becomes bankrupt. While these arguments contain strong grains of truth, they are not the whole story. Rational self-interest in a system of private property, while highly productive and necessary, has a deficit of care when it comes to that which is outside the bounds of its property. One example of an externality would be pollution of the commons. Here classical liberal Hayek also proposed intervention. Yet another example is making itself known more and more every day, and if libertarians do not respond to it correctly, we will lose everything.